opportunity to speak here. And the handout is a collection of excerpts from Rnner's text. So I will refer to them sometimes during the presentation. So let me start by briefly explaining consociationalism and centripetalism. Both of these schools aim to stabilize politics in deeply divided societies in different ways. Centripetalism aims for a kind of politics that is more in line with politics in non-divided states, a relatively strong but moderate center which is dominated by parties that are not ethnic but that compete over swing votes. In order to achieve this, centripetalism first of all tries to foster the emergence of multi-ethnic parties, or at least ethnic parties that form strong coalitions of commitment. Institutions that foster such parties and politics are electoral systems that use preferential voting, administrative federalism, and the president that is elected by means of regional distributions. Consociationalism, on the other hand, is less bothered by the existence of ethnic parties and strong group allegiances. It rather works around them, instead of submerging them in central politics, as does centripetalism. Consociationalism hollows out the center by giving the minorities cultural autonomy and by putting brakes on the politics at the center. It shares central power with minorities so that minority interests are safeguarded. The result is a politics of the lowest common denominator. Arend Leibart, the intellectual father of consociationalism, has identified 4 institutions in order to achieve this kind of politics, namely grand coalition, proportionality, cultural autonomy, and a minority veto. Now, Rnner is often associated with consociationalism, so my point is that we should not overlook the centripetal elements in his theory. It speaks to the strength of Rnner's proposals that they are not easily placed in either camp. Rnner proposed a combination of consociational and centripetal institutions. He proposed consociational institutions like cultural autonomy, proportional representation, and proportionality in the public administration. But he also proposed centripetal institutions like an undivided federal executive and legislative and administrative federalism. It would not be wrong to say that Rnner designed a careful balance of consociationalism and centripetalism. And this also implies that I will not be arguing that there are no strong consociational elements in Rnner. There are clearly strong consociational elements. I think it is therefore also correct to see Rnner as an example of consensus democracy, the sort of consociationalism light that Leibart describes in his later work. But I will argue that even though Rnner designed this careful balance, the kind of politics he aimed for was centripetal. As I will show, he aimed for multi-ethnic parties that compete over swing votes in a strong but moderate center. To make this case stronger, I will give examples of Rnner pointing out the centripetal benefits of consociational institutions. So I could say that although there are strong consociational elements in Rnner, he uses these elements as means to centripetal ends. In the first section, I will argue that Rnner's overall goal is centripetal. In the second, I will argue that Rnner does not propose something similar to the Grand Coalition, which is the most important consociational institution. So let me start my argument by showing that there are several parallels between centripetal theory and Rnner's view on democracy. Centripetalist's ideal of democracy starts with a society made up of cross-cutting cleavages that allow for formation of diverse coalitions of interest. From one issue to the next, from one election to the next, different coalitions of interest would form, creating temporary majorities for specific pieces of legislation. For each new election, there would be a substantial number of free-floating swing votes made up of voters who think that the party that they used to vote for doesn't represent them anymore. As a result, parties would compete for these moderate middle-of-the-road swing votes, and this would have the moderating effect that centripetalism aims for. Rnner describes a very similar ideal of democracy. Analogous to the cross-cutting cleavages theory in passages 1 and 2, he views society as made up of numerous layers of interest that lie next to and on top of each other. And in the next 3 passages, one can see that, similar to the centripetal ideas of diverse coalitions of interest and temporary majorities, Rnner states that there is no permanent solidarity between these layers of interest, only a free joining and separating of interest on a case-by-case basis. Like the centripetalist, Rnner also values this free joining and separating of interests. He says that every system that hampers this is absolutely harmful. And finally, there is also a similarity to the idea of parties competing over swing votes. In text 5, Rnner says that the proletariat and bourgeoisie would form two blocks which would compete over the allegiance of the middle classes, the farmers, the artisans, and so on. Not only is this in line with centripetalism, one can even see a majoritarian tendency here. If these were the similarities for ideal of democracy, then what about the divided societies? Here too there are similarities between Rnner and centripetalism. The big difference between consociationalism and centripetalism is that consociationalism is not bothered so much by the existence of ethnic parties. Belgrade takes this as a precondition for implementing consociationalism. Centripetalism and Rnner, to the contrary, aim for multi-ethnic parties. In text 6, Rnner deplores the lack of multi-ethnic parties, calling it the worst of all evil, and in text 7 he believes it is possible to draw people away from and to loosen the ties of national parties. Then, to conclude this section, let me finally give a few illustrations of what I said earlier, namely that Rnner uses constitutional institutions like cultural autonomy and proportional representation for the centripetal aims of having diverse coalitions of interest and drawing people away from their national party. When it comes to cultural autonomy, Rnner explicitly says that the free joining and separating of interests will not happen as long as the institution of national autonomy has not cleared the way for this. In other words, national autonomy in order to get centripetal formation of diverse interests, of diverse coalitions. Next, Rnner also argues that the existence of the national councils, which can be seen as a way of implementing national autonomy or cultural autonomy, would stimulate the emergence of socio-economic politics. He believes that what he calls in passage 8, the national momentum will be transferred to elections for the national councils. In other words, Rnner does not want the national momentum, I think he says, to spoil the centripetal elections for the federal parliament. So again, a consociational institution, the national council, for a centripetal aim. When it comes to the consociational institution of proportional representation, Rnner also sees this as a means towards centripetal goals. He hopes that proportional representation, because it gives a voice to all the small economic contrasts within nations, will loosen the ties of the national parties and split them into economic factions. Factions that then can be rallied together by multi-ethnic parties competing on these economic issues, which is of course the centripetal aim. Finally, in passage 12, Rnner argues that proportional representation gives minorities the insight that the federal parliament is there to deal with their common statewide interests as opposed to the special national interests. And there is a very consociational twist to this argument. Rnner says that minorities would not acquire that insight if they are constantly locked out of the power through majoritarian voting systems. But it is striking that Rnner points at the centripetal merits of not being locked out of the power, namely citizens getting the insight that they have common statewide interests and that they share goals with the members of other nations, which are of course fertile grounds for multi-ethnic parties. I think we can conclude that although Rnner resorts to consociational means, his aim, his view of a properly working democracy is centripetal. But I need not stop there. We can also turn to the analysis of the institutions. And let me finally turn to consociationalism grants coalition and show that Rnner does not propose something similar. According to Lebach, the grand coalition can take several forms. It could be a distribution of the top political jobs, especially those in the executive, among the groups, or it could be an advisory body, provided that this is a relatively strong body, a relatively powerful body. The top political jobs in Rnner's scheme are those of the Chancellor, the Federal Chancellor, and the Federal Ministers. And when it comes to these jobs, Rnner's proposal is clearly not consociationalist. He leaves free rein to the parliamentary majority, saying that the principles of parliamentary government demand that the government be responsible to the parliamentary majority. This of course creates the problem that some minorities are left without or with poor representation in the government, exactly the reason why consociationalists propose the grand coalition. But Rnner is fully aware of this problem and he decides in favor of a council of ministers that is responsible to the parliamentary majority. He doesn't leave much room in the council of ministers for a representation of the minorities, which is not very consociational. But he does make room for the minorities in the federal executive by introducing the offices of the heads of the federal administration and the institution of the Federal Council. Perhaps these institutions could be seen as a grand coalition in the form of an advisory body. So let me finally show that they lack the power to be seen as such, and start with the heads of the federal administration. These are offices under the ministers, which would be distributed among the minorities. The heads of the administration would be responsible for appointing most officials inside the administration without the interference from the minister, and they would sporadically join the Council of Ministers. But that's as far as it goes for their power. Rnner explicitly says that it is the minister who should still be seen, who should still set the political priorities, and it is also, of course, the minister who is the permanent member of the Council of Ministers. So I would argue that the office of the heads of the federal administration is not powerful enough and too administrative to be seen as a grand coalition. Another way in which, and this is my last paragraph, another way in which Rnner makes room for nations in the federal executive is through the institution of the Federal Council. This body is made up of delegates from national and regional governments and is presided over by the Chancellor, and it is part of the executive, not the legislature. The function of this body is to represent the national and regional special interests in the federal executive. The Federal Council would have the most important say in the appointment of judges of the higher court, and it would advise the Chancellor on the special interests of the federated entities. Admittedly, this institution comes close to a grand coalition, but it is not a very powerful body. In text 13, Rnner warns not to confuse this council with a ministry. Its assessments are not binding instructions for the Chancellor, they only serve for his appreciation. The Chancellor is not responsible to this council, and Rnner concludes by saying that although special interest demands to be taken into account, they cannot have precedence over the common interests. In conclusion, I hope to have shown that although there are strong constitutional elements in his theory, Rnner's primary goal is to make a centripetal democracy possible. It speaks to his genius, his creative genius, to use the words of Gerald Strootz, that decades before the academic debate clarified these positions of constitutionalism and centripetalism, Rnner already walked a fine line between both of these schools. There are strong constitutional elements in Rnner, but the centripetal elements are at least as important, and they should not be overshadowed by simply associating Rnner with constitutionalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think nobody is claiming that Rnner is not centripetal. Of course Rnner is. He's a socialist. He wants a socialist state. I mean, he's a very right-wing socialist, but of course the entire Austrian social democracy was termed the imperial royal social democracy by those people from social democrats from Germany who didn't like it, like the Austrians. So of course they were in favor of this state and they wanted to maintain it. So I think that's a very obvious claim. But what I'm questioning is whether your counterclaim that I can't pronounce this word, sorry.
Okay.
Is not centripetal as well. I think it is in very many parts as well centripetal. And I also think that Rnner's theories are in large part consociationalist. You make quotes from 1903 and 1918. Rnner also changed his mind over time, and he underlined the importance of the state more in 1918 than he did in earlier times, because he didn't like how the Bundist interpreted his writings. So he changed. So there is a development in his argument. So, for instance, in his earlier writings, there were national ministers to be in the executive. So you should have a Czech minister, a Polish, a Slovenian minister in this federal executive body. Later it has only this federal council with less powers. But the idea to bring in the nationalities into the federal government, into the executive, is present in his opinion. Not as a grand coalition maybe, but having a voice there. So I think I'm not so sure this strict opposition that you try to build up is working.
Yeah, so thank you for your question. First of all, yeah, there are quite. I can list quite a few people who say who have associated at least Rnner with consociationism. Some of whom are in this room, and I think it would be more correct for them to say that there are both elements, to recognize centripetal elements as well. As to the importance of this distinction, it's a dominant distinction in politics in divided societies. It's really, yeah, and there is quite a big difference between these two logics. So I think in the end, the part about the centripetal theory and the ideal of democracy that they have, I think they do say something about whether you can say this model is centripetal or this model is consociationalist. And I think in this sense I've argued that Rnner is a centripetalist. Yeah, although there are consociational elements. And then the last thing was, you can indeed see you could say there is a centripetal variant of consociationism, a variant of consociationism that builds this kind of centripetal polity on top of this. And perhaps the weakest variant of this is consensus democracy, and a little more stronger variant, consociationalist theories have developed recently, is liberal consociationism. And I left it out because of time constraints, but yeah, this is what I need to work on next, because I'm not completely convinced that this is a plausible position, because they seem to lose consociational elements, or there seems to be a trade-off between the consociational elements and the liberal elements in a certain way, but I still need to develop this. Overall, I just found it an interesting question to ask. I find it interesting to read Rnner in this way, this question.
Thank you very much for, I would love to read your paper when it's finished, because I think it's nice to be critical of Rnner, and I do think, I mean, I've seen in my own work advisory bodies connected to both federal and other state agencies. And I think we can all agree that advisory functions are not very autonomous, in the sense that it's up to the listener whether they will listen to the advice. So it's a question of voice, I would say, in terms of autonomy, and the idea of Entan is to begin to define what is autonomy, and I think voice is a major aspect of non-territorial autonomy.
That general question, do you think it's time to get rid a little bit of this distinction between individual and collective or group rights? I think we have to elaborate, or we have to find a way to elaborate a bit further to accommodate the characteristics. Because all of us, I mean, all individuals have a function, binary function, as a member of a group and as individuals. So this is a thing we have to reconsider finally, this thing. Within the big frame of a nation state, I would fully agree with a frame that this is problematic. The term ethnos with demos doesn't have a problem there. So that's why the national state is a problematic. So if we stay with the state, it would be better than combine it all with the nation. Okay, this was a general.
I think the legal aspect of Rnner, that's really that's very important, and it's under, right, it's interesting to investigate, and that brings me to group rights. But it's a kind of group right, which then are not. We have this situation in which there are way too few group rights recognized, or we have few cases, and we don't see what would be possible if. But then on the other end, I also think it's not because. I think the liberal theorists are also. I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, amongst philosophers, that says something. The one who writes the entry on group rights is a proponent of group rights. So it's not as if liberals don't allow for any kind of group rights. But yeah, there are many liberals who don't, which is a pity. Yeah.